I want to talk about something that women who are high achieving tend to suffer with without realizing that they are struggling with this. And that is around anxiety, high functioning anxiety, because what most people won't know, and honestly, most people don't recognize it as anxiety because from the outside, they look very much put together. So it's not the kind of anxiety that shows up in that you can't function. It doesn't show up as panic attacks or meltdowns. It tends to show up as you being more of the responsible one. It shows up in you constantly doing more, having very high and oftentimes unrealistic expectations of yourself and also unrealistic expectations of others and your relationships. And it really looks like your nervous system constantly being wired to productivity and your brain never shutting off or shutting up. So on the outside, you're going to look fine. You're going to look like you are accomplishing everything that you are very used to accomplishing. But on the inside, you're going to feel very differently. On the inside, you're going to feel quietly exhausted and like no matter what you do, it never feels good enough. And so if you are listening to this thinking, yep, that sounds very familiar, stay with me. This episode is specially just for you. Welcome to Healing Childhood Trauma, the podcast for millennial women who are ready to heal from the past. Here, we have the deeper discussions on emotional well-being and practical tips that will empower you to transform your relationships and underlying anxiety from insecure to secure attachment. I'm Lizandra, your host and psychotherapist. I'm a little bit obsessed with human development, deep conversations, and finding the lesson even in the most challenging of circumstances. I'm very happy to have you with me on this journey of self-discovery where we unpack the past and heal in the present. So let's just start with the basics. High-functioning anxiety is the kind of anxiety that hides behind productivity, being competent, and always being switched on, always having to be a step ahead. At work, it looks like you are really good at getting things done. It looks like you are very organised. There are tendencies of perfectionism. Throughout your school years, you might have been seen as a high achiever. And even if you didn't necessarily get the best grades, it was always something that you worked hard at. You were always trying to do your best because you saw a lot of your value and your self-worth coming from being good at things, whether it's being good at something educationally or whether it's being good at something creatively. Whatever it is that you put your mind to, you would kind of excel in that area. You can be a bit of a planner, you can be someone who sorts things out, who's a problem solver, but inside it can be a very different story because all of that productivity and all of that planning and all of that busyness of doing can come at a cost to your nervous system and to your emotional well-being. When you are very high functioning, anxiety doesn't look like what you would assume anxiety would look like. It doesn't mean that you're scared of doing things. It doesn't mean that you avoid certain situations. It doesn't mean that you're afraid of public speaking, for example. It doesn't mean that it's hard for you to function day to day. In fact, one of your strongest qualities is that no matter how low you're feeling, you are still able to really function and get up when you need to, even when it feels like everything within you is telling you, slow down, I can't cope, and your body wants to shut down. And when your body wants to shut down and you're not listening to it, it can come out in all kinds of different physical symptoms like migraines, chronic illness, never being able to get over the common cold very easily, having a lot of muscle tension in your shoulders or unexplained physical symptoms that you can't place where these symptoms are coming from. But you just know within yourself, you just feel constantly drained, your energy is really low, and you might notice over a period of time that your motivation gets even lower. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't still act and still thrive on those things. It doesn't mean that you can't still work, get up every day, parent, have whatever other responsibilities you have. It just means it makes it that much harder. It takes that much more effort for you to show up in the same way that you always have. And that can often be the sign that you've actually been in your stress response for so long that your body is starting to almost give up and it's trying to scream at you that you might be approaching burnout. And it's very often that high functioning anxiety doesn't get noticed as much because on the outside you look fine and nobody would know any different because you look so confident, you look so capable, and you're able to continue in much of the same way that everyone else does. Because you have such high expectations of yourself, even if you're running at, say, 60%, to everybody else, that's their 100%. So for you, you might feel as though you're failing or you're not showing up in the same way that you usually do because you have been in your stress response for so long that eventually you're not as productive as what you used to be, because there's brain fog, there's exhaustion, physical exhaustion and emotional exhaustion. But because you're so used to being productive and over-functioning, your 60%, for the most part on the outside, to everyone else is enough. It's good enough. But because you've got that high expectation of yourself, to you, that's going to feel like you're failing. That's going to feel like you're being very average, very mediocre. You're going to have a lot of internal critical thoughts around that because you base so much of your value and your worth on your productivity. And so you might be wondering, okay, so I've acknowledged that I might have some high functioning traits. I have the perfectionism. I have the inner critic. I find it hard to rest. I'm very much geared on productivity. I don't like asking for help. But what is the root of all that? Where has that come from? And what do I do to change it? And to be honest, like most things, it's going to be rooted in your childhood experiences. So maybe as a child, maybe you were seen as the responsible one. You never stepped out of line. You were always the good girl. You always conformed. You were the parent pleaser. Maybe you were the peacekeeper in your family. You were the one who was the voice of reason when perhaps the adults around you who were emotionally immature or emotionally detached were not showing up in a very adult or a very present way. Maybe you felt like you had to navigate those relationships in order for there to be peace or communication. Or maybe you just didn't want to stress anyone out. Maybe there was such volatility already in the home. Maybe there was another sibling who was taking up all of the space, or there was a parent who was emotionally neglectful or was just very harsh, very critical. There was some kind of environment where it felt like you had to be the peacekeeper, or you had to almost shrink yourself down and not cause too much of a scene in order for you to feel like you're safe. And when you become that overly independent child from a young age, because it's not a natural state for children to be independent, it's definitely not a natural part of development to feel this sense of responsibility before you've even reached emotional maturity. But what it can do is it can lead to you feeling as though you have to be self-sufficient because the adults around you are not offering the kind of support that you need. They're not in a position of authority perhaps, or they're not having a position of authority that you feel is attuned to what you need. And you won't recognize it as a parent isn't attuned to what you need. You won't recognize that as a child. You'll just recognize that you have to conform, or you have to be on your best behavior, or you don't really feel listened to, or you feel ignored, or you just don't feel understood. You don't have that feeling of safety. You feel like you've always had to figure things out on your own. So much so that now as an adult, it's just second nature. You don't even think about it. In fact, if anything, it makes it so much harder now for you to recognize when you need support or when you could do with having someone help you out with anything. So if you fast forward to adulthood, it starts looking like people pleasing. It looks like struggling to trust yourself. It looks like perfectionism and being very hyper aware of what other people need way before you start thinking about or addressing what it is that you need. You tend to end up being in the role of the fixer, the helper. So everyone will come to you for help and support, but you don't do the same. You don't seek support from anyone else. You don't rely on community because you're so used to being independent that asking for help feels more like a burden to you. And you're probably going to really hate feeling like a burden in any sense of the word, even if it's for something so small and so minor. You would just rather not go there. You would rather just deal with it yourself and not have to ask for anything. Because if you ask for something and then you get let down, like you have been let down so many times in the past, it's just a big disappointment that you don't want to have to feel. So you try to not put yourself in that position, whether that's consciously or unconsciously. Because you are so used to holding all of this together, holding yourself together, holding other people up, you won't necessarily look at it as a form of anxiety. But all of this over-functioning and hyper-functioning, it most definitely comes at a cost. So let's talk about that cost, because it's real, and even if you don't notice it, you're going to feel it. And you're going to notice that constant tension in your body. You're going to notice that It feels difficult for you to be able to switch off your thoughts at night. You're going to get really irritable and impatient if you feel overwhelmed or if you feel like there's too many things going on because you're trying to juggle everything by yourself. You're going to wake up tired every day, no matter how much sleep you get. Your body is going to feel the exhaustion, and you're going to carry so much guilt from feeling like you're not doing enough, even when you are still doing all of the things and showing up in so many different ways and always pouring out into others, pouring into your work, pouring into your friendships, pouring yourself into being a parent, being a wife, being a sister, being whatever the responsibilities that you have. You are going to be so used to the output, but you're not going to be used to pouring more into yourself. That in itself is going to feel quite foreign to you. So self-care is going to go out of the window. Doing things that are just for you are going to feel self-indulgent. And the thing is, because you always look like you've got everything sorted and you look so put together, it means that no one really notices when you are struggling. And it's not because you don't have friends or people around you who care about you. They care and they might notice that something is off, but because you always give off this sense of you don't need anyone, or you are so capable that you almost get offended if anybody offers to help you, they don't really check in with you in the same way that you might check in with them. Because there is this assumption that whatever happens, no matter what you're going through, you're cool. But that's because no one sees the weight of everything that you've been carrying. And this is exactly what high functioning anxiety looks like. It's how so many high functioning women end up in burnout. You learn to be hyper independent because you had to be. Because if you didn't fix it, then nobody else was going to fix it for you. You can anticipate what other people need because that's what you've always had to do. You've always had to read the room. But the good thing with that is when you learn to be so attuned into what everybody else needs, it's something that is a learned behavior. And if it's something that you can learn, it is always something that you can unlearn. It's often a process of your nervous system having to relearn what safety feels like and to not only be driven by productivity and keeping busy. Because often the busyness comes from not wanting to slow down. Because if you slow down, the reality of what you are thinking and feeling is going to hit you like a ton of bricks. And what you are trying to do is avoid having to go there. You're trying to avoid having to feel anything too deeply because there's almost that fear of if you feel it too deeply, one, are you going to be able to get back up? And two, what do you do with all of these really massive feelings that you've been trying to hide from for the last 20, 30 plus years? It can feel really overwhelming in the moment, but it's about teaching your nervous system that it's okay to rest. It's okay to experience safety. You don't have to wait for the other shoe to drop. You don't have to be walking on eggshells and waiting for the next fire that you have to put out. That's what nervous system regulation is all about. It's recognizing safety and that you don't always have to be functioning in your stress response, which is what that busyness is. It's functioning in your stress response. I'm going to talk a little bit about a practical plan here because I know as a high functioning person, you like a plan, yeah? You like lists. You like to know what it's going to look like going from A to B. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what that can look like. Because honestly, if it was just about self-care, relaxing more, you'd have done that already. So let's take it to another level just so that you can think about it in a different way and see how you can maybe bring some more of this into your life if you are someone who identifies with a lot of the high functioning traits that I've talked about today. One of the first things is recognizing your early signs of overwhelm. So notice when your shoulders are becoming really tense or when there's a lot of tension happening in your body. Notice if you start to get more irritable or your tone gets sharper, you're snapping at people much quicker, your patience is running low. Notice those early signs of your sleep being disrupted or not feeling rested. When you're feeling tired, you're going to be tempted to keep pushing through anyway. And it's recognizing when that is happening so that you're not just always pushing through and ignoring those early warning signs. In that, you're going to learn how to pause rather than just pushing through or ignoring those signs. It doesn't have to be a huge break. It doesn't have to mean taking the day off or ignoring your responsibilities. It could be just as much as taking a pause of 5 minutes, assessing how you feel, assessing what your body needs, and looking at what your energy levels are and putting into context, what have you done that week? What have you been doing the last month? Have you just constantly been on this cycle of work, 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 crashing out at the end of the day without having any real intentionality with what you're doing? Or just doing things very mindlessly and not being very engaged, or not being very social, not feeling very connected? Just taking a pause to recognize when those signs are coming up for you. And I think I probably go on about this so much, but it's because of how important they are for you to be able to show up as your best self in all different aspects of your life. And that is through boundary setting. And you have to get used to practicing boundaries that doesn't feel like a punishment. It doesn't have to be these big, huge announcements or dramatic boundaries, but it's just learning how to say no to things sooner, or saying, I'll get back to you on that, and not always feeling obligated to give an immediate yes or an immediate response, and getting away from the habit of over-explaining things, especially if it feels like you can't do something, and over-explaining and different relationships that don't need that much context because there is so much guilt around you not being able to do something. And I think this is probably where you're going to struggle the most, and that is letting more people in to support you slowly. You don't have to turn into someone who suddenly leans on everyone for everything. And to be honest, that's probably never going to happen, right? But it's looking at how you can start to let people in just enough so that you're not always being the only person who is holding the weight of everything. You're just allowing yourself to not always have to be the strong one all of the time. So just letting in some gentle support in a way that feels right for you, but is also going to feel somewhat uncomfortable. A little discomfort is good. That's the growing edge. And then the final part, I think, is about building more trust within yourself. And this is often where the deeper work in therapy comes in, because it's looking to understand, well, where is the root of those problems coming from? Why don't you feel safe when you slow down? Why do you feel guilty anytime you need to rest, or when you need to put yourself first? Because it's often rooted in something. It's rooted in some form of relational pattern that has happened along the way that has set up how you think, feel, behave. So just for context, I'm going to give a typical client story. Now, obviously, as a therapist, my work is confidential, so it's not about any one particular client, but it's more about the pattern of clients that I see, and I'm just going to mesh it into one so that you get more of a idea of what this high functioning looks like just on a very normal day-to-day basis. So I once worked with someone who thought she had a productivity problem, right? And that she wasn't hitting enough of her goals, or she wasn't as productive as what she was used to being. So she thought it was just a case of her getting more organized, getting her life together, getting her shit together, and having more of a plan. But really what we had uncovered is that she spent a lot of her childhood having to be the responsible one in her family. So she thought, because of what she saw in her own home, was that it was very normal for you to just always be exhausted all of the time. So she thought always running at 100%, that was just the standard. That was just the norm. That was what you did, because that was how everyone else lived around her. But she never stopped to think about, well, why do I think this way? And is this way serving me? So once she understood her patterns and she started working with her nervous system instead of working against it, everything started to change. And it wasn't that she stopped being ambitious, or that she stopped achieving in her career path, or she stopped being productive. But what she did stop is burning herself out to maintain this image of having to be the strong one. And that's the thing with healing. It doesn't take away the essence of who you are. It just makes you have a softer life inside the life that you already have. If you're listening and you're thinking, okay, literally this is me, this is the work that I do with many high achieving women. So if you do want support and you recognize that you are tired of facing a lot of these burdens on your own, and it would just be amazing if you didn't have to pre-plan everything and think 20 steps ahead because there's no one else to hold that baggage for you, that's the work we do in therapy. And it doesn't have to be a deep exploration into your childhood. Looking at your childhood is often just understanding the patterns. And so you might understand where the patterns come from, and you might look back and reflect on relationships and things that you noticed from the past, but you don't stay there. It's more about understanding where you are in the present and how you can move forward in the future. If that sounds like something that you want to work on, the link to book a consultation is in the show notes. And you can find more on my website, which is www.newframetherapy.co.uk. Or you can come and connect with me on Instagram or TikTok at New Frame Therapy, or you can find me over on LinkedIn if you are in more of a professional space. Okay, that's it for today. I will catch you in the next episode. Take care. Thank you for joining this episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. Remember, healing is a journey and you are not alone on this path. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. And you can share this episode with a friend. Your feedback helps this podcast to reach more women who are ready to heal and build secure, healthy relationships and heal from the past.